was going to make this review actually be the next Prince of Persia game, but after the Two Thrones, I was getting tired of them. So I wanted to make this review something different, just for a nice change of pace. Prince of Persia reviews will return, don't worry. You know, I still remember the day that I found this game as well. I was living in Dartmouth, and my friend and I went over to EB Games, and I saw it on the shelf. I thought it looked cool, and it was super cheap too, so I bought it. You know, I actually remember as well that my friend watched me playing it, and they actually thought it looked so cool that they asked me to borrow it, and they wound up beating it in a week, playing it all the time after school. Afterwards, they returned it to me, I beat it, but after, it kind of just stayed in my collection, gathering dust. It wasn't until this review where I would play it again, and all of the memories, good and bad, would come flooding back. So sit back and relax while I tell you all about Folklore. In this game, you actually take control of two different characters. One is Ellen, a timid woman who receives a letter from her mom, who she hasn't seen in 17 years, telling her to come to the village of Doolin to find her. The other is Keats, a writer for an occult magazine who receives a phone call telling him that a fairy is going to kill her, and for him to come to Doolin to save her. Before Ellen arrives in Doolin, the boat driver that takes her there tells her that it's a cursed village and people who go there wind up dying. It's actually nicknamed the Village of the Dead. Before Keats arrives, he sees Doolin on a magazine cover, and it shows him that it's a town where people can communicate with the dead. When Ellen arrives in Doolin, she goes to the edge of a cliff to speak with a woman with a hood on. Hiding her face, she keeps asking if it's her mother, but the person will not reply. This is when Keats comes in as well, and asks if Ellen is the one who phoned him, to which Ellen tells him that she has no idea what he's talking about. While they talk, the body falls over the cliff. Ellen runs to the bottom of the cliff to the beach, and when down there, she can't find the body and she faints from being overwhelmed. To her, it looked like her mother just died. In her unconsciousness, there's a voice that tells Ellen to come to the pub at night. And when she goes there, all she sees are ghosts. Well, actually, these are called half-lives. They are between living and dead, kind of like they're stuck in limbo. The half-lives tell Ellen about the Netherworld, the land of the dead, and if she wants to find her mother, that would be the best place to look. The only way to get into the Netherworld at this point is to wait for the Night of Samhain, which is a prayer day for the dead, and when night falls, there's a henge to the south of the village that opens every year. It just so happens that Ellen came to Doolin on the Night of Samhain. Talk about luck. Ellen goes down under the henge, and while down there, meets Scarecrow, who is kind of like Ellen's escort into the Netherworld. He explains to her that the Netherworld is a dangerous place, and to be able to travel around, she has to wear the cloak of Sidhi. Sid? City? Side? This word, which will allow for combat in the Netherworld. At the same time that this is happening, Keats actually followed her in there and sees her put on the cloak, and this makes him become a guardian. But it honestly doesn't mean much. The game is just giving an excuse to let Keats go to the Netherworld as well. He's not literally Ellen's guardian. Keats also has an escort as well, named Belgay, and he's like an invisible gentleman. He's pretty cool. Following the plot so far? Good, because it's about to get a lot more confusing. The problem this game has is that there's too much story, with each chapter telling you a little mini-story of one of the villagers, which would be fine, but each villager's story relates back to Ellen and Keats' main plot in some way, and that's where it gets kind of overwhelming to try to explain it. Now, the way you play is that the game will give you a character selection screen of Ellen and Keats, and you can choose who you want to play as. However, at the end of each chapter, you can either choose to continue as the same character or switch over to the other one. The way that I played it for the review is that I went back and forth between the characters, and I think it should be played this way. I do find it funny that if you go on Keats and go off of him, he gives you this look like, oh, come on, man. However, I think at this point, since Ellen and Keats just entered the Netherworld, it would be a great time to explain how combat works in this game. So, what you fight against are creatures called folk, and when you hit them enough, you can either absorb their ID, or you can hit them enough until they die so that they have a chance of dropping items. Absorbing them is how you collect them, and then the new ones you get you can equip to X, square, circle, or triangle, and use them to fight other folk. If you absorb an ID of a folk you have currently equipped, so like a double, that's how they gain experience and level up. When folk level up, they gain certain skills such as like stronger attacks, more attacks in a single combo, less MP consumption, etc. Which reminds me, every time you use a folk, it requires MP, so you do have a limit to how many folk you can use at once, and how many times you can use a singular folk. Thankfully, your MP recharges, but your health does not. To heal, you have to either find a save point or pick up health drops that heal you instantly. There's also different ways to absorb different folk depending on how big they are. For simple folk, it's just a simple flick of the controller, but it changes for bigger folk to having to wait until the ID is read, shaking the controller up and down, tilting the controller side to side, or balancing the ID into the center, and honestly, the movements are pretty fun, even if they are silly. Alright, so Ellen and Keats are in the Netherworld, but for right now I'm going to focus on Ellen just so I can try to avoid confusion while I explain the plot. So, Ellen went to the Netherworld to find her mother, and after fighting a few folk, you come across a woman who looks a lot like Ellen's mother, but it's not her. It's the woman from the cliff. The woman instead blames Ellen for something that happened 17 years ago and calls Ellen possessed. This is where you would switch to Keats or continue as Ellen, because it's the end of the chapter. I'm going to explain as if you switch to Keats because that's the way I played and it's the way I can make any sense of this gosh dang mess. So, playing as Keats, after battling a few folk as well, he comes across the same woman that Ellen met, and he tells her that she is dead. Her response is to tell Keats to find a girl named Suzette in the village who is her daughter. Keats and Ellen meet up again in the real world and tell each other of their experiences in the Netherworld. Ellen goes to talk to Suzette, who explains that her mother used to call her by her dead brother's name, and when she realized she wasn't him, she would beat her. Her mom went to the cliff because that's where Suzette's dad died 17 years ago, and a lot of people think that the mom murdered her dad by pushing him off the cliff. This is when you get your first memento, a way of getting into the Netherworld on any night that's not Samhain. When Ellen or Keats offer it to the henge, the lighthouse will turn on and reveal a portal that they can jump through to go to the Netherworld. In order to find Suzette's dad to ask him what really happened, Ellen will have to defeat the Folklore, the bosses of this game, and each realm has their own unique one. However, one big problem I have with this game is that Ellen and Keats fight the same Folklore, in the same area. They will fight Folklore using different kind of folk, such as Ellen using wind to blow off leaves to reveal a weak spot, or Keats lights it on fire, but that doesn't save the repetitiveness of fighting each boss twice. The only time it changes up is near the end of the game, but I'll get to that later. It's at this point that you meet the Fairy Lord, an all-powerful fairy that knows everything and can tell Ellen where to find the Folklore. He also tells Ellen that by defeating the Folklore, she can find out more about her forgotten past and possibly find her mother. If you're playing as Keats at this point, you would be meeting Levon instead, and her whole purpose is to be in opposition to the Fairy Lord and try to stop him and save the Netherworld. I won't get into their whole thing just yet, or we'd be here all day. This game does something pretty clever in figuring out enemy weaknesses. They do it through picture books. As you play as one of the characters, you can come across these crystals that you can break, and sometimes it will drop collectible items, or health pickups, or a page from a book. If you hit start, you can go through the picture book and the writing is in a different language I don't understand, but the pictures are usually enough to understand who to use when you're fighting against a certain bigger folk. I love this idea a lot because 1, it rewards exploration even if the game is linear, and 2, there are a lot of folk to use and choose from, so this gets rid of any sort of trial and error. Another thing is that each folk have elements, such as fire, water, wind, destruction, and non-elemental. And each crystal has different colors to them. To destroy the crystals, you must match the element to the color, otherwise it will have no effect. Same goes for fighting certain folk. You have to find their weaknesses, and you'll know what they're weak against because when you hit them, their ID will pop up, and you can absorb them. Okay, so you're playing as Ellen and you just defeated your first Folklore. Hooray! When this happens, a door appears with what appears to be the Eye of Sauron in the doorway, and when Ellen goes through it, she appears in the pub in the village where a mounted deer head tells Ellen that the dead will be here soon. This is where Ellen meets Ronaldo, Suzette's father, and you find out the names of Suzette's mom and brother, Regine and Hervé. Ronaldo explains that 17 years ago, Ronaldo and Regine visited Doolin for a short while. Hervé got murdered while they were there, and Ronaldo mentions a boy named Ryan that went to the lighthouse. But before he can explain any more, time runs out and he vanishes. In his place, there's a folk that feeds on memories, a Nemesign. It shows Ellen that Ronaldo left a message in a bottle on the beach before he died. Also, it shows that Ryan delivered the news that Hervé had died, and Ronaldo confronts a little girl on a cliff, and winds up falling off when he tries to attack her. Suzette hasn't been born yet. Ellen returns to Doolin to talk to Suzette and give her the message in the bottle. It reads that Ronaldo did actually care quite a bit for his family, and loved them more than anything else. It's at this point that Ellen and Suzette begin to question why Regine brought Ellen to Doolin in the first place. To explain that, we have to switch over to Keats, and his chapter begins by proving to Suzette that she is related to Regine by showing a photo of a happy family hidden inside a doll, and promises that he'll try to find who murdered Regine. Going back into the netherworld, using the photo as a memento, you learn that Keats actually has another power from being a guardian, called Transcendence. It essentially makes him transform and become very strong for a limited time. It's kind of cool to see the first time, but honestly, I only used it once or twice. It's enough to just use the folk you have equipped. So, you do the same thing you did as Keats as you did as Ellen. Make your way through the fairy realm and defeat the Folklore. Keats encounters the same doorway and walks through it, and in the pub he meets up with Regine, who tells him that she saw something in the church, and the Nemesign she turns into shows Keats that Regine did in fact write the letter to Ellen and brought her to Doolin. She did it out of revenge because she believes Ellen murdered Ronaldo and Hervé. Keats goes to tell Suzette everything he learned, and this is where he also tells Ellen, and when he leaves her house, he sees a mysterious hooded woman and thinks that he's going crazy. All of this only happens in the prologue and the first chapter. This is what I mean by all of the many villager stories tie into the main plot. But to keep the rest of the plot open to you guys, I'll leave the rest of the chapters alone and just say this. Every chapter is the same premise. You choose Ellen or Keats, they talk to a villager that someone referenced in the previous chapter, they find a memento, the lighthouse shows a new portal to a different realm of the netherworld, they go into there and find and kill the Folklore so they can go through the door again and talk to another ghost and their Nemesign, and either it will give you another clue to the murder mystery or show little hints to Ellen's past. Now, I mentioned different realms, and I think this is where the game really shines. Each realm represents something unique about the afterlife. Fairy Realm is a perfect starting point. It's the closest realm to the human world, so there's a lot of peace in this realm. Next is Warcadia, where the dead who wander here had a sudden or accidental death, and they wander a sort of battlefield trying to find their way home. Undersea City is a realm where spirits go that want to be forgotten. Fourth is a realm called the Endless Corridor, and it represents the eternal anguish of those who have lost their belief in an afterlife. Finally, there's Hell Realm, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's hell. It's where the spirits who have done something horrible in reality go to be judged. Exploring these areas are all super fun, and finding out the lore behind them is all really interesting to me. I highly recommend if you play this game, talk to everyone. Oh yeah, and each folklore for each realm is super cool and unique. I absolutely love the fact that Ellen and Keats can use different folk to fight each folklore, but I do wish that instead of just using the same boss twice for each character, they each had unique ones to fight. To me, that's just lazy game design, and plot-wise it makes no sense. It's basically saying that when Ellen kills the folklore, it just comes back for Keats to kill it. So what's to stop it from coming back again? Nothing. It's a pretty big plot hole. Now, I'm about to talk about the game's ending, so if you don't want to hear about it, you can skip here. And if you do, well, I'll still say spoilers, because this game has a heavy plot and a lot of twists. Alright, here we go. Okay, so to help you understand this ending, I have to talk about the dispute of Levon and the Fairy Lord. Back in olden times, there were a pair of trees called the twin trees found in the Netherworld core, and they are the thing that creates the bond between the souls in the Netherworld and the real world. About 5,000 years ago is when Levon entered the Netherworld core and left a spear in one of those trees. The reason being because long before that, ancestors of humans and Levon's people mingled and shared knowledge of the Netherworld, and humans began to accept death and no longer feared it. This ideology is what started wars between the humans and Levon's native people. To stop this from happening again, Levon destroyed one of the trees to sever the bond between the souls, and so the human world would have less influence. The Fairy Lord didn't like Levon's actions because he's from an older generation who doesn't enjoy things changing so drastically. Therefore, he shunned Levon and started protesting against her ways of progression, and asked Ellen to help save the Netherworld, quote-unquote, by visiting the 5 different realms, because that is the only way to reach the Netherworld core and pull the spear out of the tree. Ellen being the only messenger is the only way the Fairy Lord can reach the core now. They follow her wherever she goes. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I have to explain one more huge thing, and it's about this little girl. This girl is the most important character in the whole game. Her name is Cecilia, and she was the one who was being blamed for all the murders 17 years ago, which included Hervé, Ronaldo, and Ryan. I'm going to say this right now, that she had nothing to do with the murders. Hervé died from natural causes. He was sick, and Cecilia just hung out with him every day, so everyone thought she had cursed him. Now, Ronaldo and Ryan's death is a bit more confusing, but remember when I said that Keats had seen a mysterious hooded woman? She was the one who murdered them. Why? Because Cecilia was her daughter, and she was trying to protect her. The big twist of this game is that Ellen has been looking for her mother, but she's been around Doolin the whole time, watching from afar and protecting her. Ellen is Cecilia. Her mother made her change her name so that she could have a new life that wasn't her on the run from being blamed for Hervé's death. Alright, let's talk about this finale. The whole time you're adventuring, the Netherworld residents tell you about this thing called Oblivion, and how it's a thing that's swallowing all of the Netherworld. It turns out that Scarecrow, Ellen's guide for the Netherworld, wanted to reach the core so he could release Oblivion and strike fear into people again. Ellen and Keats realize that this is the wrong way to do it, so they stop him together. But damn, this is a really good final boss fight. Keats fights off some crowheads until the main body comes down, and then he beats that to a pulp. Then, when it tries to fly away, Ellen hops on it and fights in this awesome, beautiful stage above the clouds. The boss itself is not difficult in any way, but the locations are so beautiful and the fight itself is pretty fun. Also, it's the only boss that isn't repeated. Ellen and Keats each have their own unique fight of the same boss, and I love it. I wish each boss of the game were done like this. There's also a boss fight of Keats versus the Fairy Lord and Ellen versus Levon before the Scarecrow fight, but they are super easy as soon as you figure out their gimmick. And it's just to use the element they're weak against to get rid of their shield. You don't have to worry about absorbing them either. The fights just kind of end. You'd think that a fight against 2 of the main NPCs would be a lot more thrilling, but it just comes off as disappointing and boring. After defeating Scarecrow, Ellen and Keats are back in Doolin now, and it's time for both of them to go home. But the game allows the player to say their goodbyes to the villagers. After doing that, when you return to Keats, he tells Ellen to go search her hut one more time before leaving, because he remembers seeing something in the corner of the Nemesine's memories. Ellen winds up finding the final issue of Keats' magazine that was published back in 1989, and a drawing of Hervé with it. Something I forgot to bring up earlier is that Hervé wanted to be a writer, and Keats comes to the conclusion that he is Hervé. Honestly, I thought that this twist was way better than the Ellen is Cecilia one, because the game makes you focus on Ellen's mystery so much that you kind of forget about Keats, which I think is pretty damn clever. Now, you're probably wondering how it's possible that Keats is Hervé if Hervé is supposed to be dead. Well, remember when I brought up the fact that Scarecrow and Belgay and all those ghosts in the pub are things called half-lives? Well, there you go. Keats is exactly that. The game even hints at it at the beginning of the game when it shows Keats' office, but it doesn't show anything outside of the windows except for white, like it's his own personal limbo. The ending is Ellen and Keats meeting and talking again in his office, and Ellen saying goodbye to him and Keats looking at the drawing one more time and laughing at how uncanny the resemblance is to him. Then, credits. Alright, I think I did an okay job explaining that plot. Sorry if it was kind of all over the place, but I do recommend this game because it is good. The combat is a lot of fun, absorbing the ideas is unique, and I like that it feels like you are the one pulling the idea out of the folk. The story I genuinely think is interesting, and I did miss some stuff on purpose because I wanted to leave some stuff for all of you to experience. I didn't really talk about the music or graphics, but honestly, there was not much to talk about. Music is kind of forgettable, and the graphics look like a PS2 game. There, done. Anyway, I hope you all have an amazing day or night whenever you're watching, and as always, take care.